Picture the Great Depression. Bread lines wrapping around city blocks, fathers selling their tools for a bag of flour, families crammed 6 to a room, praying the landlord doesn't notice the rent is 3 weeks late. Now picture this, in the middle of all that misery, a woman getting pregnant on purpose, again for the 11th time, because a dead man's lawyer is going to hand her a fortune if she just keeps winning. That's not a plot for a dystopian novel. That happened in Toronto, Ontario. For exactly 10 years, women raced each other through pregnancy after pregnancy for a shot at a small fortune left behind by a man who found the entire spectacle absolutely hilarious. Newspapers tracked leaderboard like it was a horse race. Lawyers built entire careers arguing over whether a stillborn baby counted. A judge who was himself one of the 9 children had to decide with a straight face who had won the human reproduction sweepstakes. Welcome to the Fertility Void, the place where grief, greed, poverty and biology all crash into each other at once. Today we're digging into a will of Charles Vance Millar, the millionaire practical joker who accidentally turned childbirth into a decade-long spectacular sport, and women who paid real price for his punchline. Get comfortable, this one has a body count of paperwork. Before we get to the babies, you need to understand the man who started this whole mess, because Charles Vance Millar is one of the strangest human beings to ever held a law license. Millar was born in 1854 in Aylmer, Ontario, and by all accounts he was disgustingly good at making money. He graduated near the top of every class he ever took. He became a lawyer, built a private firm, and quietly amassed a fortune through investments most people considered reckless. Long shot horses, long shot stocks, long shot everything. He owned race horses, including the King's Plate winner. He was president and part-time owner of a major Toronto brewery. He once modernized an entire stagecoach company out west by swapping the horses for automobiles. Decades before that was a normal business decision. And yet, despite all that money, Millar lived like a man allergic to comfort. He never married. He had no children. He disliked signing contracts and preferred handshake deals, which is a wild personality trait for a lawyer. He wasn't a member of a single social club except a yacht club, and by most descriptions he treated his own wealth less like a comfort and more like an inconvenience he'd accidentally accumulated. What Millar actually loved more than money, more than horses, more than beer money, was watching people's true colors come out. His favorite pastime, and I promise I'm not making this up, was dropping dollar bills on a sidewalk and hiding in the bushes nearby just to watch strangers scramble to snatch them up when they thought nobody was looking. He called it an education in human nature. Most people would call it deeply unhinged behavior for a grown millionaire. Millar called it Tuesday. So when this man, a bachelor with no heirs and documented hobby of manipulating strangers for entertainment, sat down in 1921 to write his last will and testament, you can probably guess where this is going. He wrote the whole thing himself, told almost no one what was in it, and ignored his own lawyers when they begged him to tone it down. He kept his cards close for 5 more years. Then, one night on October 31st, 1926, Halloween, appropriately enough, Charles Vance Millar dropped dead at his own desk in his law office, mid-meeting of a sudden heart attack. He was 72 years old, and that's when the joke he's been sitting on for 5 years finally got read out loud. At 4:30 in the afternoon on the day he died, Millar's lawyers opened the will. What they found wasn't a normal boring list of who gets the china cabinet. It was a document practically engineered to humiliate everyone in it. Let's run through the appetizers before we get to the main course. Millar owned significant shares in the Ontario Jockey Club, the horse racing establishment of the province. He left those shares to 3 men. 2 respected pillars of the community, and 1 man with such a shady reputation that under normal circumstances the club would never have let him anywhere near a membership. Millar forced them into business together anyway, presumably just to watch the awkward small talk unfold. He also owned a stock and brewery. Who did he leave that stocks to? A group of devout prohibitionist Protestant ministers, men who had spent their entire careers publicly condemning alcohol as a moral plague on society. Now they were shareholders in the exact industry they built their pulpits attacking. Imagine the sermon that Sunday. Drink is the devil's tool, and also thank you all so much for the dividend check. And then there was the vacation property in Jamaica. Millar left it to 3 lawyers, on one very specific condition. They had to live in the house together. The catch, these 3 men despised each other. Not professional rivals who nod politely at conferences, genuinely, personally could not stand to be in the same room, hated each other. Millar handed them a beach house and basically said, "Figure it out, boys." But all of that was just a warm-up act. The real headline, the clause that would consume the entire decade of Toronto's attention, was Clause 9. In it, Millar stated, in essentially plain English, that the bulk of his fortune, somewhere around $500,000, worth close to 9 million Canadian dollars today, would go to the mother who's, since my death, given birth in Toronto to the greatest number of children over the 10 years following his death. The births had to be legitimate, and they had to be properly registered under Ontario's law. Nobody knew if he meant it as a genuine act of generosity, a cynical stress test of the legal system he'd spent his career manipulating, or a dark joke about how far desperate people would go for cash. Some historians even argue it was a coded political statement, an attempt to embarrass the government into legalizing birth control by putting a giant, grotesque spotlight on unrestricted reproduction. Knowing the guy's track record with sidewalk dollar bills, I personally think that Millar just wanted to die and leave behind a single greatest practical joke in Canadian history. Mission extremely accomplished. Here's where the timing turns from funny to genuinely brutal. Millar died in 1926, 3 years before the stock market collapsed and dragged the entire world into a Great Depression, which means the bulk of his 10-year baby race played out during the worst economic catastrophe of the 20th century. Think about what that actually meant on the ground. Men were losing their jobs by the millions, families were being evicted, food was scarce, and any extra mouth to feed was for most households a genuine financial threat, not a blessing. And yet across Toronto, women were entering their 3rd, 7th, 10th pregnancies in a single decade, chasing a jackpot that could be the difference between poverty and financial freedom for the rest of their lives. Newspapers ate it up. Reporters started publishing informal leaderboards, tracking which families were pulling ahead in the court. By 1933, 5 leading families had a combined total of 56 children between them, though only 32 of those births actually qualified under the will's strict rules. The public followed it the way you'd follow a pennant race, except the athletes were exhausted mothers and the stat sheet was a birth registry. It's worth pausing here because it's easy to make a joke about this, and we absolutely will, but we have to sit with what this actually asks of these women's bodies. This wasn't a baking contest, this was pregnancy after pregnancy, delivery after delivery, in an era with limited parental care, during a decade when hospitals and doctors were themselves strapped for resources. Whatever Millar intended when he wrote that clause, the women competing for it were making an incredibly real, incredibly physical bet with their own health on top of an already brutal economic reality. Naturally, Millar's distant relatives, people who received absolutely nothing under the will, took one look at the growing pile of money and decided they wanted a piece of it too. They filed legal challenges trying to have the entire clause thrown out as against public policy. Even the Ontario government got greedy. In 1932, the provincial legislature tried to pass a bill redirecting the unclaimed fortune away from the mothers entirely and over to the University of Toronto instead. The move sparked public outrage because nothing unites a struggling public quite like watching politicians try to snatch prize money out of the hands of exhausted new mothers in the middle of depression. The bill collapsed under the backlash and the derby continued. As the 10-year deadline crept closer, in the fall of 1936, 32 different Toronto women officially filed claims asserting they were the rightful winners. This is where the whole affair stopped being a quirky news story and turned into a genuine legal bloodbath. Justice William Edward Middleton, a judge who happened to be one of the 9 children himself, was handed the impossible job of separating fact from fabrication. His court had to examine birth certificates, hospital records, and courtroom testimony to figure out which births were legitimate, properly registered, and actually within Toronto city limits. What followed was 2 years of some of the most invasive, publicly humiliating scrutiny imaginable, all conducted on exhausted women who had spent a decade doing exactly what the will asked of them. Grace Banato, an Italian-Canadian mother, was disqualified in the earlier rounds partially because several of her children weren't properly registered, and partially, according to critics, because her husband was an undocumented Italian immigrant, a fact that fueled ugly xenophobic commentary in the press at the time. Her story was disturbing enough that it later became the emotional center of a Canadian television film about the whole saga. Lillian Kenny had given birth an astonishing number of times, by some counts a dozen children within the decade, but several were stillborn or never properly registered. Justice Middleton, in a line that still reads as unbelievably cold, ruled flatly that a child born dead is not in truth a child. Kenny was disqualified. Pauline May Clark had 10 children, but several of them born outside her marriage, fathered by a different man entirely, a relationship marked by real domestic abuse according to the court testimony. The judge ultimately ruled that Clark had effectively abandoned some of her children with relatives and disqualified her claim as well. Both Kenny and Clark fought back, appealing all the way toward the Supreme Court of Canada, and ultimately accepted out-of-court settlements of $12,500 each just to make the whole ordeal stop. It's a strange kind of consolation prize. Give birth 10 or 12 times, endure a public trial about the legitimacy of your own children, and walk away with a fraction of what you were promised, while newspapers across country debated your morality over their morning coffee. After narrowing the field down from 32 claimants to a handful of serious contenders, Justice Middleton finally reached his verdict. It was a 4-way tie. Annie Catherine Smith, Kathleen Eileen Nagel, Lucy Alice Timlock, and Isabel Mary McLean had each delivered 9 properly registered, legitimate children in Toronto during the 10-year window. 4 women, 4 families, one enormous shared jackpot. According to reporting from the period, the husbands behind these winning families included a civil servant, a fireman, a city parks department employee, and a quiet carpenter of deep religious faith who reportedly viewed every one of his children as a gift from God, which financially speaking turned out to be extremely accurate. The payout itself took nearly 2 full years to actually process, chewed up substantially by legal fees, court costs, and a trust fund set aside to cover the whole ordeal's continuing expenses. When the dust finally settled, each of the 4 winning families received a substantial sum, worth well over $1 million in today's money. And then, because apparently winning a decade-long fertility marathon wasn't stressful enough, the money brought its own plague of vultures. Within a day of the payout hitting the news, salesmen were lined up at winners' front doors, hawking furniture, farmland, and fur coats for families who 24 hours earlier had living paycheck to paycheck through the worst economic collapse in modern history. One of the winning mothers reportedly complained to a reporter, "The way these people pester me, you would think I came into a fortune." She had in fact come into a fortune. This was rather the point. Now here's the part that really sticks with me. Charles Vance Millar had never met a single one of these women. He never saw a single one of these babies. He was 10 years dead before his so-called joke even finished playing out. And yet his little prank reshaped a decade of real lives, real pregnancies, real courtrooms, real families, torn apart by a judge's ruling on the technical definition of legitimacy. The story didn't even end with the Derby itself. Decades later, Toronto's own mayor, Thomas Foster, a man who died in 1945 with a fortune of his own, apparently looked at the chaos Millar had caused and thought, "You know what, let's do that again." His will launched 4 of his own smaller Stork Derby contests through the following decade, because apparently one man weaponizing childbirth as a lottery wasn't a strange enough legacy for the city of Toronto. The Great Stork Derby has since become a made-for-TV movie, a novel, a stout beer brewed in Toronto as a wink to the whole absurd affair, and a genuinely popular episode of a well-known history podcast. It is remembered today as a quirky slice of Depression-era trivia, a kind of story you tell at a dinner party to get a laugh, but underneath the punchline is something a lot more uncomfortable. A rich man's idle sense of humor turned working-class women's bodies into a contest during the decade in modern history when they could least afford to say no to the prize money. Millar wanted an education in human nature. He got one. He just didn't have to live through it himself. Stay strange, stay sharp. Never trust a man who thinks watching people scramble for dropped cash counts as a hobby. See ya.